Hey, I'm Ramtin Arablouei.
I'm Rand Abdel Fattah.
And welcome to the first episode of Throughline.
I'm not going to lie, I'm still a little bit shocked that they gave us a show.
I know, I can't believe we're here.
But we're really excited and really glad that you decided to join us for this ride.
Yeah.
Because Ramtin and I have been talking about this for a while. Like a lot of you, we're news junkies, and we were just pretty frustrated with the lack of historical context around a lot of the headlines we were reading.
And we would end up in these Wikipedia wormholes trying to figure out the history behind things.
Mm-hmm.
So we wanted to create a show where you, the listeners, and us could go on this journey every single week and become better informed about the world around us.
And do it in a way that wasn't boring.
Yes, exactly.
So in this first episode, we're going to take you to Iran and the story of 4 days in 1953. All right, Ramtin, you were born in Iran and you've spent a bunch of time there. So I'm curious, how much had you heard about this American coup growing up?
I definitely heard stuff about it, especially from my father, who would remind me all the time, like, the only reason we're here in the U.S. is because what the U.S. did to our democracy in 1953, right? And I would always just kind of, like, brush it off, like, whatever, that couldn't have happened. It's just like Iranian conspiracy theory stuff, right? But as I grew up, I realized the U.S. actually did interfere in Iran's politics in 1953.
I'm going to be honest, like, I didn't have much of an idea about this going into the episode. And it's like a really big, shocking thing to not have much of an idea about, because I always thought that 1979 was the real pivotal moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
That the Iranian Revolution that happened that year and the hostage crisis at the American embassy, those were the things that really set the tone for, like, this very tense relationship between the U.S. and Iran.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Like, why would you or any other American think differently, right? Because 1979 was such an important year. But 1953 is really when it all goes down.
Doesn't it suck that your dad was right?
Yeah, it really does. It does.
Okay, I want to get into it. It's a great story. So we're going to take you back to that pivotal moment more than 65 years ago to understand what happened during the coup,
why the U.S. made that decision,
and how this event redefined the U.S.-Iran relationship and changed the world.
Why?
They call you Lady Luck.
August 16th, 1953.
At times you have a very unladylike way of running out.
In the early morning of August 16th, 1953, American agents were hiding out in a safe house at a secret location in Tehran, listening to this song, Luck Be a Lady Tonight.
Luck be a lady tonight.
They were waiting to hear whether the coup they had engineered had worked. And the mood was electric. Music blasting, booze flowing, everyone celebrating a job well done.
Now, remember, this is 1953. So there were no breaking news alerts, no email, no good way to deliver information fast.
So as far as these guys knew, the coup had gone off without a hitch.
And there was one guy who was especially happy, Kermit Roosevelt.
So Kermit Roosevelt was chief of the CIA's Near East and Africa division.
Like many of the figures in the early CIA, he had been born into privilege, gone to Ivy League schools. His grandfather had been Theodore Roosevelt.
Distant relative of FDR as well. He was called in to help facilitate this transition.
So, on July 19th, 1953, Kermit Roosevelt crossed over into Iran.
This is Stephen Kinzer. He wrote a groundbreaking book on this coup called
All the Shah's Men.
And Sanam Baki,
Oh, okay, now you can hear me. Hello.
a research fellow
How
at
are
Chatham
you?
House in London, where she leads the Iran Forum Project. And they were our guides through this story.
Okay, so Kermit Roosevelt entered Iran on July 19th with a pretty big mission ahead of him. Stage a coup to get rid of Iran's prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh.
And we'll explain why in a bit.
But the first question Roosevelt had to answer
I've asked myself this question.
was how.
So, you're sent into a foreign country and your assignment is overthrow the government. What do you do? Like, what do you do on the first day? 9 o'clock, you get to the office. How do you start?
Even though the CIA had devised a plan for Roosevelt, no one was sure it would actually work. It was suddenly up to Roosevelt to destabilize a whole country.
Step 1.
Seize control of the Iranian press.
Basically buy them off with bribes.
Turned out that the press was quite corrupt.
And soon enough, Roosevelt had columnists, editors, and reporters from most of Iran's newspapers on his payroll. Then, anti-Mossadegh propaganda began printing everywhere.
Mossadegh was a Jew, a homosexual, a British agent, anything that they thought would outrage people.
There was such an appetite for these stories that Iranian journalists just couldn't keep up. So Roosevelt had to recruit CIA agents back in Washington to write some of the articles for the Iranian press.
In fact, one of them later wrote a memoir, and he talked about how bizarre it was. At the CIA, you had the people plotting the Iran coup, and then you had analysts on the other side who weren't aware of the covert action. And he said, I would write an article about how Mossadegh was an atheist and he hated God. And then a couple of days later, a guy from the other side of the hall in the analysis division would run over to my office holding up an Iranian newspaper and saying, wow, you won't believe how the newspapers in Iran are denouncing Mossadegh. Look what this article. And I couldn't tell him I wrote that article.
Step 2. Recruit allies on the ground. Most importantly, the Islamic clergy, or mullahs, who held a lot of power in Iran.
Kermit Roosevelt made strategic payments to a number of important mullahs in exchange for them delivering sermons denouncing Mossadegh from the pulpit as against God and irreligious.
Step 3. Get Iran's king, the Shah, on board.
And convince the Iranian Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, that Mossadegh was a threat.
This part took some persuading, though.
Yeah, because in theory at least, the Shah and the Prime Minister were meant to work together.
But there was a lot of tension between them, because for decades, Iran's parliament and Shah had a tough time sharing power. It would be a big deal for the Shah to help overthrow the Prime Minister. But Roosevelt saw an opening to turn them against each other.
That included bribing the Shah's sister in exchange for her help convincing the Shah to sign on. And there are reports that a fur coat was even part of the deal. But that tactic failed.
Eventually, Roosevelt took matters into his own hands and began meeting with the Shah almost every day at midnight in a taxicab, always in a different location. During these late-night meetings, Roosevelt managed to convince the Shah that Mossadegh was a threat, and so the Shah agreed to the coup.
And finally, step 4, go to Mossadegh's house in the middle of the night, arrest him, and consolidate power in the hands of the Shah, who was more friendly towards the West than Mossadegh.
But remember, the coup attempt failed.
At this point, you're probably wondering why the U.S. went to all this trouble, sending Roosevelt to Iran, having him stir up chaos in the country, and ultimately trying to carry out a coup. Why were they so hell-bent on getting Mossadegh out of power?
Well, the truth is, the U.S. was dragged into the situation by Great Britain, all because of one thing.
A fifth of the world's oil supply was cut off, and nationalist feeling ran high against Britain and the Western democracies.
We sometimes say that countries are blessed with resources, but sometimes resources can be a curse, particularly if you're a country that's weak, because there are always strong countries that want to come and take what you have.
And Iran was cursed with a lot of oil. Oil was discovered there in 1908, and almost immediately, Great Britain took an interest. And at that time, Britain was the world's biggest superpower, so they decided to strike a deal with the Iranian Shah, and they needed a lot of oil.
This deal between the British and Iran was completely one-sided.
Great Britain was taking well over 80% of the revenues, while Iran was receiving about 10 to 12% of the revenues from its natural resource.
Wait. A deal like that makes no sense, though. Why did Iran agree to that?
Well, yeah, it makes no sense unless you're in desperate need of money. And Iran's government in the early 20th century was desperate.
Iran, during the early part of the 20th century, was still ruled by the old Qajar royal dynasty.
See, for centuries, the country had been ruled by shahs, or kings, with power passing from fathers to sons. But by the turn of the 20th century...
the corrupt, irresponsible business dealings of the shahs were driving the Iranian economy straight into the ground, which made the shahs really unpopular among the people.
And this wasn't like normal corruption. We're talking crazy, excessive spending.
Yeah, like one shah had a harem of 1,600 people.
1,600?
1600. And he and his many, many sons would use the national treasury as their personal piggy bank, taking money out whenever, they wanted to travel around Europe.
He also demanded that people call him one of the following names.
Shahanshah,
Shah of Shahs,
Ariamesh,
Asylum of the Universe,
Buzurg ارتشداران
subduer of climate,
نگهبان گله
guardian of the flock,
سایه خدا در روی زمین
or shadow of God on earth.
I could see you wanting to be called guardian of the flock.
I,
Or would
honestly,
you prefer shadow of God on earth?
I personally like subduer of climate.
What does that
just
even
feels,
mean?
I don't know, but it just feels
We
like
need a subduer of climate right now.
we do need one right now. You're right.
Anyway, point is, the Shahs were out of control.
This was a very corrupt dynasty, and it supported itself by selling off anything of value in Iran.
They sold off the transportation industry, the tobacco industry, the caviar fisheries. They even sold off the country's treasury and banking industries. It was basically a free-for-all, and the British were first in line. Oil was by far their most valuable acquisition. And here's a fun fact. The company that controlled all of that oil was originally called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which would later become...
Every day, BP supplies the fuel and
BP.
lubricants that start the
Oh,
engines
British
of over
Petroleum.
30 million vehicles all over the earth.
So this was obviously very lucrative for them.
Very lucrative. And during World War I and II, Iranian oil pumped life into the British war effort. So it was absolutely essential to Britain's future.
Okay, this all really helps explain the next part of the story, right? Because before he's even prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh got to work lobbying against this unfair oil deal, hoping to get a better deal for Iran.
He tried to negotiate a new deal with the British that would allow Iran to keep a bigger share of the profits.
Which I'm sure freaked out the British.
And when negotiations broke down, the British imposed a worldwide embargo on Iranian oil. Eventually, in 1951, Mossadegh convinced the Iranian parliament to nationalize Iran's oil. And a month later, he was elected prime minister, which really sent the British through the roof.
Premier Mossadegh, spearhead of the oil nationalization program, took his case to the United Nations, where he remained adamant in his
So the
stand
British
to
decided
raise
that the
specter
only
of
solution was to
possible
get rid of
West Indian
Mossadegh and put in a more favorable government. And Mossadegh, sensing the British were up to something, shut down their nationalize Iran's oil. And a month later, he was elected prime minister, which really sent the British through the roof.
Premier Mossadegh, spearhead of the oil nationalization program, took his case to the United Nations, where he remained adamant in his
So the
stand
British
to
decided
raise
that the
specter
only
of
solution was to
possible
get rid of
West Indian
Mossadegh and put in a more favorable government. And Mossadegh, sensing the British were up to something, shut down their embassy in Iran.
And here's where I'm assuming the U.S. enters the picture, right?
Right.
So they called the Americans for help. And President Truman said, no, you're not going to do it. He actually sent a mediator to Iran. He had Mossadegh come to Washington to try to persuade him. But when nothing worked, he essentially told the British, there's nothing you can do. You're going to have to swallow this. Like we had to swallow Mexico, nationalizing its oil industry in the 30s. We didn't like it. You're just going to have to live with this.
But the following year, Dwight Eisenhower became president, and his thinking was a little different.
Suddenly, you don't have an American president who forbids military action, but on the contrary, you have a new team that's eager to show that it's going to roll back threats to the United States, and that played right into the British hands.
Plus, this was right around the time when the Cold War was heating up, and Iran happened to share a border with the Soviet Union.
So what can he do to show that he's fighting communism? Well, he can't bomb Moscow. He's not going to invade China. You can't go after the real enemy. It's not possible. So you have to go after somebody else.
Iran also, in this period, and I think it's important to mention, there was a communist party known as the Tudeh that was active in parliament, was supporting Mossadegh.
And even though, by all accounts, Mossadegh was not a communist himself, the U.S. was still on high alert. So all these factors...
A, the British want us
eventually
to do it.
convinced the U.S.
B, Mossadegh is threatening the world economic
to get on board
order.
with Britain's plan.
C, we're desperate for a victory.
To stage a coup and overthrow Iran's prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh.
And yet before this evening is over, you might give me the brush. You might forget
At 6
your
a.m. the
manners.
morning after the coup attempt, Roosevelt and his men, tired from a night of partying, tuned into the radio. But all they heard was silence. And Roosevelt knew something had gone wrong. Then, suddenly, the radio crackled on. Military music started playing, and Mossadegh announced victory over an attempted coup. He noticed that the Shah was nowhere to be found and immediately suspected that the Shah was behind the coup attempt. Meanwhile, the Shah knew this might happen, and fearing Mossadegh would come after him, hopped on his private plane and flew to Baghdad.
And from there, he went on to Rome, where he told reporters, I'm probably going to have to look for work now because I'm obviously never going to be able to go back to Iran.
So to recap, at the end of day 2, the Shah had left Iran. Mossadegh was still in power with no idea that the U.S. was behind the coup attempt, and Roosevelt had failed. But even though his bosses back in Washington told him he could go home after the coup failed,
Kermit Roosevelt was not willing to give up that easily. I think it came a little bit from the old CIA can-do mentality. I think he also sensed how weak the Iranian political establishment was. He thought he still had assets that he hadn't used.
Mossadegh wasn't out of the woods just yet.
Kermit Roosevelt had not given up and was having a plan B.
August 19th,
1953.
Attention is focused once again on the Middle East, where events in Iran have taken a dramatic double twist.
During the 3 days after the Shah fled and Roosevelt's coup attempt failed,
Roosevelt set the stage for his second coup attempt. And on August 19th, it began.
hundreds and hundreds of rioters filled the streets of Tehran. And in a word, it was chaos.
300 killed and hundreds wounded is a conservative estimate.
And his plan was this. First of all, hire gangs of Iranians through people who controlled criminal protection rackets and pay them to go out on the street and cause chaos.
So Roosevelt actually paid criminals and gang members to storm into the city,
Beat up people in the streets,
break shop windows,
Shoot your guns into mosques.
and while doing all that, yell,
We love Mossadegh. We love communism.
and then,
He hired a second mob to attack the first mob.
which led to bloody, violent clashes between the two mobs.
And the really trippy thing was that everybody involved
In the battles was being paid to be there, but what they didn't know was they were being paid by the same source.
The CIA. And all of this was designed to create confusion and to signal that Mossadegh was the source of the violence in the country, that he was losing control, which was becoming more and more true.
Mossadegh refused to send the police out because he said, well, they're peaceful demonstrators. People should be allowed to say what they want. He truly was too naive to grasp what was happening.
And this brings us to the final part of Roosevelt's plan, to get rid of Mossadegh once and for all. Roosevelt ordered both mobs to head to Mossadegh's house,
So a giant crowd surrounded Mossadegh's house.
shouting insults and throwing stones.
Then who should show up but several police and military commanders, including a couple with tanks, people who Kermit Roosevelt had bribed to participate.
Those officers began opening fire on Mossadegh's house, while inside, Mossadegh and a few of his closest advisors huddled together.
Tells them, I want to die here in the house. But somehow they managed to drag him out a back window. They got him over a fence. He fled. The house was looted. And immediately thereafter, Kermit Roosevelt went to get his savior general, who he'd been hiding in a safe house, brought the guy to a radio station, and the guy proclaimed himself as the new leader of Iran.
So this guy, General Zahedi, was put in power as a placeholder until the Shah, who remember had fled to Rome, could return. Mossadegh eventually turned himself in, and just like that, with a couple of chess moves, Kermit Roosevelt's plan ushered Iran into a new era.
The Shah, who had fled to Rome, comes home, backed by General Zahedi, military strongman, who engineered his return to power.
Everything Mossadegh was, the Shah was not.
Which isn't really surprising, given the corruption of the Shahs.
The Shah then ruled over Iran like a dictator for 25 years. And the Western powers, including the U.S., didn't really care because he gave them easy access to Iran's oil.
During that time, the Shah did everything in his power to get rid of any trace of the Mossadegh era.
Mossadegh's name was banned.
Again, Dr. Norouzi.
You don't hear anything about Mossadegh after the coup. And that was the time I was actually in high school. I don't remember anything, much.
Mossadegh, the coup, they were off limits, things that the Iranian government wanted people to forget.
Under these conditions, Mossadegh became a sort of legend, a symbol of Iran's lost potential.
The CIA only officially acknowledged its role in the coup in 2013, 60 years later.
In case you're wondering what happened to Mossadegh.
So he turned himself in.
In the quick shift of power, Mossadegh was finally apprehended and awaits trial.
And was placed on trial, was convicted of treason, and sentenced to a prison term followed by life under house arrest. A couple of his closest advisors were executed. There were hundreds of other executions of people who were suspected to be disloyal in the military. And Mossadegh remained almost a taboo figure almost for the rest of his life.
As for Kermit Roosevelt?
Kermit Roosevelt stayed in Tehran to wait for the Shah to come back from Rome and then arranged a farewell meeting with the Shah before leaving Iran. The Shah greeted him with a toast, and he said, "I owe my throne to God, my people, and you." He was right, although it might not be the right order. So Kermit Roosevelt went home, and of course, he was welcomed jubilantly back in Washington as a kind of a conquering hero. He went on to more years at the CIA, then later left, became an oil consultant.
Oh, and speaking of oil, the holy grail of resources that started this whole thing, as you might expect, Iranians still ended up with a pretty bad deal after the coup was said and done.
Iranian oil may again flow westward.